So, hello everyone. If you've been here already, welcome back. To those who are new, welcome to the Mediating Scale Conference. I've organised together with Magdalena Krysztoforska. My name is Oliver Kenny, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel with Sasha Crawford-Holland and Anushka Perez. Just some housekeeping. So please note that this session is being recorded. The two panels in this paper will be presented one after another. The first one has been pre-recorded, so I'm going to play the video, and then Anushka is going to present hers live. And then after that, we will have roughly half an hour for a discussion. So please, as always, post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. You can post them at any time, and we'll try and put as many of them as we can to our speakers. Please try to formulate your questions concisely, and please try to make sure that you do put them in that Q&A feature rather than in the chat. Okay, so bring in Sasha. So Sasha Crawford-Holland is a PhD candidate and SSHRC doctoral fellow in cinema and media studies at the University of Chicago, researching how people use non-fiction media to organize power relations. Sasha's dissertation examines how media rescale social experience by extending and modulating thermal perception. Sasha's writing about media politics has been published in Film History, Television and New Media, Synoptique, and American Quarterly. And today, Sasha's talk is entitled Oppressive Heat, Scaling Extreme Weather in Local Television. Like I said, the talk's been pre-recorded, so I'm now going to play the video, and Sasha will be joining us afterwards for the Q&A.
Hi everyone, my name is Sasha Crawford-Holland, and I'm a PhD candidate in Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. And just to provide you with a bit of background on this project, I'm working on a dissertation about how media extend thermal perception. So basically the idea is that evolutionarily, our bodies used to perceive heat relatively well enough to keep us alive, and increasingly that's no longer the case because the scales at which thermal exploitation, risk, and violence are perpetuated elude our direct perception. And so each of my chapters looks at how thermal perception is therefore extended and accordingly habituated through a different epistemic mode. So these modes are imaging, coverage, forensics, and modeling. And today I'll be talking about coverage, focusing on local television. In July 1995, a brutal heat wave killed an estimated 739 Chicago residents. At its peak, the heat index reached 50 degrees Celsius. However, the event didn't initially register as dangerous because it lacked the scalar qualities through which media cultures usually make sense of catastrophes. It was neither sudden nor spontaneous, it was spatially diffuse, and it offered no spectacular visuality. So for days, city officials and media professionals failed to treat the event as an emergency. Only when the county morgue had to store overflowing corpses in refrigerated trucks outside did newsrooms and city leaders belatedly shift to emergency mode. The scene provided a time, place, and image of disaster that television could now process through familiar conventions of coverage. But by this point, much of the harm had already occurred. So the disaster became socially real once it was environmentally over. The aesthetic conventions of catastrophe premised on rupture also obscured longer continuities of violence and organized abandonment that had distributed differential vulnerability to the heat long before its arrival. Victims were disproportionately poor, Black, elderly, and living alone. Many were in bad health and didn't have access to air conditioning. City leaders and columnists blamed victims for their own deaths or naturalized them as inevitable, promoting this notion that they were about to die anyway, and the city soon moved on. So what did these people die of? Social abandonment, a weather disaster, state racism, pre-existing medical problems, old age. Each of these posits a frame that's inadequate to the multi-scalar etiology of thermal violence. So today, I first want to highlight how disasters are fundamentally indeterminate events that aesthetics help us stabilize. Often this is done retrospectively at a large scale. If we think about how catastrophes like 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina are processed retrospectively on national news. But I shift from this emphasis to instead examine how local television mediated the heat wave for people who were within it during it, so before the scene at the morgue. The weather means radically different things to different people. It depends on your job, your body, the conditions you live in, etc. And local news is a particularly vexed site where these differences are negotiated. So I find that local coverage resolved these tensions through an aesthetic of relatability that appealed to the common sense of an average viewer. Of course, this notion of an average viewer is itself problematic, and so this leads me to look at the politics of averaging in local news and weather coverage, to think about how demographic averaging of viewers guided thermal and historical averaging. And so it's this final section on averaging where I reflect most explicitly on the politics of scale and on this event's implications for how we think about environmental violence today. All right, number one, disaster aesthetics. So heat waves don't conform to our aesthetic imaginaries of catastrophe. They lack the instantaneous temporality of an earthquake or an explosion, the precise location of a tornado or a collapsed building, the spontaneity of an accident or an assassination, and the clear visuality of a train crash or a forest fire. News coverage usually depends on images of impact to visualize disaster, but heat waves can't really be reduced to a moment of impact or to a clear visual after effect. Occasionally, images of infrastructural failure, like roads buckling, could serve this function, and then once the heat wave was over, the morgue could become a stand-in. But during the heat wave itself, news imagery consisted overwhelmingly of recreational images of people cooling off in public space. And this conjured an impression of the heat wave as a collective, lighthearted experience rather than a socially differentiated and dangerous one. Heat waves also evade dominant grammars of visual capture in news and weather coverage. So TV meteorology is all about animating the weather. In its early days, weathercasters used everything from impassioned gestures to live drawings and puppets that would compensate for their still maps. And then by the 80s, showcasing new technologies becomes the priority. So radar and satellite imagery, which register precipitation, clouds, and wind, predispose coverage to focus on hurricanes, blizzards, other storm systems, not on heat. So we can see here, for example, this is a still from Weather Channel coverage of the heat wave, and there the weathercaster needs to use her fingers to contour the negative space in between these various storm systems in order to indicate where the heat wave is occurring, because the dome itself doesn't register on the technologies that are privileged in this meteorological visuality. So because they don't conform to these established modes of coverage, heat waves can help us recognize how aesthetics delineate disaster. There's an emphasis in TV coverage and in TV scholarship on sudden, spectacular catastrophes, but I would contend that the disasters most threatening our world today are different. Climate change, disease, financial precarity, environmental racism, radiation, digital insecurity, etc., are all, like heat waves, non-visual threats diffused across space and time and characterized by uncertainty. They distribute indeterminate risks that accrue and cascade across multiple scales of harm, concentrating their effects on vulnerable populations. heat waves are not only increasing in frequency and intensity, but are also paradigmatic disasters. And one big reason for this is that heat waves are indeterminate and multi-scalar events. So identifying that a heat wave is happening, tracing its causes and effects, depends on the scale of observation. And they're defined at a regional scale based on a numerical increase from local averages. So, that's why if I turn on my oven, that doesn't count as a heat wave, and global warming doesn't count as a heat wave. It has to be stabilized at a regional scale. But the factors that distribute heat are multiscalar. So environmentally, you have different levels from the statistical trends of global warming to regional weather systems to building materials, infrastructures, and vegetation that makes some neighborhoods hotter than others. And then, of course, vulnerability to heat is patterned by social forces, so access to healthcare, air conditioning, social networks, and other resources all end up dictating who lives and who dies during heat waves. And then even for medical practitioners, there's a causal indeterminacy. So if heat exposure aggravates someone's heart condition and that causes them to die, or if it causes a disability that then leads to a death days or even months later, heat may be recorded as a primary cause of death, a contributing factor, or omitted entirely from a death certificate. And these protocols are largely not standardized. So the heat wave is this case of extraordinary weather colliding into ordinary social conditions. Its effects ramify across different scales. How did mass media contour the disaster into a stable epistemic object? To answer this question, I focus on local TV, in part because that's where most Chicagoans are getting their news in the 90s, but also because I want to understand what the event was like for people inside of it. So disasters usually become evident in retrospect. News helps us process events and impose historical closure on them once they're already over. Again, think 9/11, for example. But what about an emergent event, especially one like a heat wave that lasts for days? When you're watching a heat wave on local television, you're in it. Disaster is not a remote rupture. It's an ambient event inside of which populations are differentially situated. But despite those differences, television as a mass medium collectivizes perception. It extends thermal perception in space and time. So the very capacity to determine that Chicago was in the midst of a heat wave was enabled by mediated access to climate and weather data that rescaled viewers' thermoceptive faculties. I argue that TV modulates thermoception quite literally at an embodied level. When the telegraph made it possible for signals to travel faster than storms, it disarticulated weather knowledge from direct phenomenological observation. So today we tend to sense the local weather by looking down at apps or maps, not by looking up at the sky. Media's extensions to thermoception exercise an aesthetic biopower because thermoception is a vital function. We use it to stay alive. And media increasingly help us execute that sensory function such that we can't increasingly properly execute it without them. So thermoceptive media affect the embodied experience of heat exposure. If you're in a heat wave, knowledge of heat's extent and intensity, of when it will end, of whether cooler spaces are accessible nearby, of how other people are experiencing it, all mediated through aesthetic forms that attach meanings to heat, these all affect how it feels. And that's especially true for elderly people who were most vulnerable to the heat wave because our thermoregulatory systems gradually lose the capacity to effectively sense and respond to thermal changes. So there are testimonies, for example, from paramedics during the heat wave arriving and finding seniors dead wearing sweaters because their bodies weren't able to effectively perceive the thermal conditions that they were in. And so in these sorts of conditions, especially when people are socially isolated, television then plays a really important role in conditioning how the heat wave felt. And it did so by collectivizing thermoception despite the diversity of thermal circumstances in which viewers were situated. Not everybody experiences the same weather. Cities don't have uniform temperatures, people in them don't have universal access to climate control, and our bodies all sense and experience heat differently. Heat exposure was most dangerous to those inhabiting forms of social and environmental seclusion, so a lack of mobility, of social contacts, and of air conditioning, that made them disproportionately reliant upon TV. There are serious, even life and death implications to the ways that television collectivizes thermal perception. So when the local temperature has such radically divergent implications for different people, what does it mean to call a forecast or the news or anything local? The local is no more authentic and no less fraught with disagreement than any other frame. Temperature, I argue, provides a useful lens onto this problem because it is itself an average that is contingent upon scale. Every thermal description aggregates and differentiates at a particular resolution, such as those inherited from medicine, body temperature, geography, a region's temperature, or geology, the temperature of an era, an epoch, effacing the thermal variations within each object. But if we aim for precision and resist generalizing, then we topple ourselves into a black hole of infinite regress, because none of these resolutions is necessarily more or less accurate than any other one. They just have different implications. So what scalar frames did television impose to average temperature and mediate the heat wave? How were those decisions made? Across the televisual archive, I found that coverage resolved the contradictions that attend the local by cultivating a harmonious aesthetics of relatability that minimized both social and thermal difference. Relatability was an epistemic ideal that regulated coverage of the heat wave. For many viewers, the most credible journalists and meteorologists were not the most professional ones, but those who seemed like real average people. Emphasizing cultural and geographical proximity enabled local coverage to distinguish itself from national news. So in contrast to the flyover feel of national broadcasts, local coverage was spatially and affectively grounded. Authority derived not from a disembodied voice of God, but from a plain-speaking observer. Local coverage cultivated the sense that the people on TV could just as well be you, because they live nearby, and because they reacted to the world just like you might. Local news prioritized emotional and cultural accessibility as avenues, not obstacles, to knowledge. Similarly, the expertise of the local meteorologist was not only their scientific knowledge, but also their familiarity with the local context. That's what enabled them to translate the weather from a physical science into practical information. Weather knowledge increasingly comes from distant centers of calculation, usually operated by the National Weather Service in the US, but then weathercasters reground that knowledge and make it local again. They can make it meaningful as a shared cultural experience. Despite being an unattainable abstraction, this ideal of relatability quite systematically guided newscasts' aesthetic and discursive conventions. Lighthearted banter, for example, connected disparate situations to anchor viewers in a common experience of the local. And here's just one quick sort of representative clip from ABC 7, which was the most watched newscast in Chicago at the time.
All are peaceful places except on weekends, of course. And ciao for now. John.
That's a combination.
John was here. All you good people. John was here, but he left. Yeah. All of you good people here and out there, and that includes Jerry. Happy Bastille Day.
Well, it certainly was a sweltering night to have dinner at a garden cafe tonight.
Yeah, I think everybody was inside with the air conditioning, but they'll be back outside shortly because we do have some relief on the way, as I explained earlier. Our high temperature today, after hitting 104 yesterday, we hit 100 degrees, but notice...
All right, so perhaps a silly example, but it underscores the persistently lighthearted coverage and the ways that banter serves to create a common experience and to connect disparate segments that might be about very different things, contributing to what Raymond Williams would call the flow of the broadcast that overcomes fragmentation. So I think it's fair to say that colloquially, nothing unites people quite like the weather. It is nice to have something in common. Meteorologists moralized forecasts as if they were universally good or bad. Sportscasters blamed the baseball team's loss on the heat. Terms such as we and here, recurring frequently, conjured a spatial imaginary of the city's atmosphere as a continuous shared environment. Human interest features about Chicago's best garden cafes or the struggles of modeling fall fashion in the heat on the top right there trivialized the extreme temperatures. And as we've seen, recreational images of people cooling off in public predominated coverage, promoting the inoffensive idea that we're all in this together. It's a nice idea, but coverage rarely extended its attention to the vicissitudes of what Yuriko Furuhata terms indoor weather, even though it was those indoors, not outdoors, who were most at risk and who were disproportionately reliant upon television to understand those risks. Broadcasters repeatedly assumed that viewers had universal access to climate control, and their repeated advice was to stay indoors. So this brings us to the political consequences of averaging. Heat exposure was stratified, but local news's aesthetic of relatability made it feel like a collective experience. Relatability was guided by a conception of the average viewer that excluded certain populations. And similarly, temperature is an average. Measuring temperature, like measuring a population, involves political decisions about what bodies or years to count, what information to discount, and what relations to account for. And so I think we can read these two operations of averaging, of populations and of temperature, as being congruent. When I say that relatability was regulated by an account of the average viewer, I mean that in a really literal way. So, executives instructed local stations to defer to the recommendations of market research consultants, and these researchers conducted millions of qualitative surveys distilling the affective, aesthetic, and thematic preferences of the so-called average viewer. Newsrooms then used those averages to consolidate a local common sense, which involves styles of rationality, but also literal sense perceptions. And it's really incredible the degree to which all of this research dictates exactly what newscasts are doing. So for example, even just the banter that we saw in that previous clip is basically required because of how much viewers like it, or how much the average viewer likes it. Of course, averaging is not a neutral operation. These are just some of the places we might look to think about a media history of averaging in its politics. Consultants composed averages from the local media market that encompassed suburbs and rural areas around Chicago. These viewers' preferences shaped the aesthetics of local news, its episodic, story-driven format, and lighthearted tone elevating personalities over politics. This power dynamic is connected to the history of white flight. Television had enabled white populations fleeing desegregating cities to maintain cultural hegemony over the publics from which they were divesting. So the geographical periphery became the ideological center that dictated how urban life was covered and who it was that relatability related to. While local coverage commended middle-class Chicagoans for prudently purchasing air conditioners, it criminalized black children for opening fire hydrants to cool off, even though both of these practices ended up incapacitating critical infrastructures. Coverage's market-driven emphasis on narratives of self-reliance and dangerous crime even exacerbated the thermal vulnerabilities of seniors who were ashamed to ask for help and afraid to leave their apartments. Ashamed to ask for help because of these neoliberal ideas of self-reliance, and afraid to leave their apartments because of an inflated perception of crime and their likelihood of being victimized. So those who were most reliant upon TV were least served by these conventions. This market populism insulating white supremacy could compel us to reject averaging as a homogenizing practice, but I think the case of temperature suggests that we need to approach averaging as a necessary operation, scaffolded by contingent scalar demarcations. In other words, we can't avoid averaging, we just need to scrutinize the epistemological and political stakes of those demarcations. Averaging requires a scalar decision, what Zachary Horden calls a resolving cut, to stabilize a domain that isolates certain features and occludes others. These cuts are epistemological, because stabilizing scale allows disciplines to order knowledge, and they're political. As Max Liboiron shows, scale frames what relationships matter within a particular context. So by inframing relations, resolving cuts structure our perceptions of causality. For example, for climatologists analyzing the causes of heat waves in Illinois, meteorology's synoptic scale led them to isolate the relationship between soil moisture and atmospheric humidity as determining whether an oppressive heat wave would occur. A different disciplinary scale might resolve a different causation for oppressive heat. We could equally focus on racist histories of redlining that have made black neighborhoods thermometrically hotter than white ones, on patterns of immiseration and policing that deprive poor people of access to air conditioning, or on cuts to programs that used to help seniors pay their energy bills. All of these are pertinent, but they're difficult to commensurate without an attunement to scale variance, this idea that different rules obtain at different scales. And local coverage obscured that variance. Instead, the relations made to matter were those reified through its aesthetics of relatability. Broadcast's thermal aesthetics are entangled in the politics of population because procedures for averaging temperatures, events, and viewers become coterminous. Coverage has to generalize local descriptions, from weather stations' temperature readings to journalistic imagery and sound bites, that stand in for a larger phenomenon. And when regulated by the ideal of relatability, its resolving cuts are guided by this conception of the average viewer. So thermal variations disappear in proportion to the assimilation of social difference. These operations affect risk assessment. So heat waves, heat wave mortality, and racism are all defined based on deviations from averages. In establishing those averages, certain harms and injustices are accounted for in advance, while others are exceptionalized. So, for example, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism concerns exposing people to premature death, vulnerability to premature death. And in order to assess whether a death is premature, you need a measure of what deaths are not premature. And within that calculation or averaging of that establishes non-premature death, you have certain violences that are being accepted within it. So broadcast meteorology monopolized the scalar frame through which coverage averaged the distribution of heat. This occluded other relations and variations. Meteorology scales were not only epistemologically privileged, but they were universalized. This isn't a critique of meteorology, meteorologists do important work. Rather, my concern is with the ways that local TV's aesthetics of relatability naturalized what Horden calls scalar collapse to make it seem like meteorology scale was the only one that mattered. Critical interventions have since reframed the heat as a social, not a natural disaster, patterned by spatial irregularities. For example, in Judith Helfand's documentary Cooked, from which this is a clip, she elucidates the film's subtitle, Survival by Zip Code, in a sequence dissolving successive maps of Chicago partitioned by zip code. Each image charts geographies of differential vulnerability by coloring the zip codes most affected by a particular variable, such as school closings, unemployment rates, food deserts, life expectancy, and other social factors. And then these maps are overlaid atop an underlying one that visualizes the spatial distribution of heatwave deaths in the city, those black dots that you see. So here, Helfand insists on the primacy of political relations or social relations rather than environmental ones. I think the question that remains then, in my view, is how to think across incommensurate scales when they cumulatively produce thermal violence. Helfand's still isolating a particular one. Although local television imagined thermal uniformity, non-smooth, non-linear thermal processes threaten media's own infrastructural basis. And so this is clear, for instance, during the heat wave, when elevated temperatures and elevated electricity use triggered power outages that disabled televisions across Chicago. Certain cuts resolve features that are more salient to particular problems than others, but the Chicago heat wave ultimately attests to the importance of apprehending how processes cascade across heterogeneous domains of organization. And that's especially important for us on a planet whose disastrous heating is irreducible to any single scalar frame. Thank you. Really looking forward to your questions.